In this lecture we're going to be talking about what was happening in the lead up to the Industrial Revolution. Because that was an event that was concentrated in England and Europe initially, that's going to be our focus. In the last lecture you remember that I talked about a key feature of this period being the relatively slow increase in living standards compared to what came after. In this graph I've shown a variety of measures of the evolution of material well-being in England from 1300 to 1900. Two of these are wage series for craftsmen, that's the Clark Real Wage and the Allen Real Wage series, and two of them are alternative measures of GDP per capita, BVZ and Broadbury et al. If we look at the whole of the time period, you can see that the different series are telling a relatively similar story. That in the period up to the middle of the 17th century, around about 1650, relatively slow or little increase in living standards over time. It's after 1650 that we get the gradual acceleration in living standards through to the present. If we look at specific periods, starting off with the period before 1650, you can see that there's a little bit of a difference between the different series. For example, the Clark Wage series shows a large increase in wages during or following the Black Death, and then a decrease that took wages back to the level that they'd been at before that event. Whereas the GDP per capita series show an increase following the Black Death that is sustained over time. There's been quite a bit of recent debate about which of these two versions of the period before 1650 is correct. For our purposes, what's important to note is that both stories show a relatively slow rate of increase in living standards compared to what came after. Then if we look at the period after 1650, we can see that all of the series are showing a relatively uniform story of gradually accelerating increase in living standards. That's the story for England. If we look at some other countries in Europe, we can see that the story of relatively static living standards up until 1650 was a feature that was shared with most other countries in Europe. So for example here we've got data on countries like Belgium, Germany, Centre, North Italy, and you can see that for those countries in the period up to 1650 there's relatively little change in living standards. The one exception in the period before 1650 is clearly the Netherlands, which in the 16th and 17th century saw relatively large increases in its living standards. If we look at the period after 1650, then we can see that it's England that stands out from this feature of having had increases in living standards and relatively rapid increases in living standards. Other countries in Europe during this period sort of are having living standards that are less changed from the previous period. And so England, you can see, in fact, catches up and passes other countries which had been the leaders, such as Belgium and Italy during the 18th century. So when we put the story from these data together, I think that they raise three questions. First of all, we see that there was a long period of history with no or limited improvement in material well-being. This is often referred to as the Malthusian era. The second thing we observe is that an early exception to this pattern was the Netherlands, which saw a substantial, at least by historical standards, increase in material well-being in the 16th and 17th century, but which wasn't sustained past that time. And thirdly, we have the case of England, which is a later exception, where there was an increase in living standards which was notable, and the other feature that's notable is that this increase in living standards was sustained across time. In the rest of this lecture, in a variety of ways, we're going to take up these three summary points and try to understand more about them. I'm going to start off by presenting one way in which it's possible to understand this Malthusian era where there was relatively little change over time in living standards. Then I'm going to talk about an aspect known as the rise of the Atlantic traders. This is about the voyages of exploration that various countries in Europe undertook around about the 15th and 16th centuries and what it meant for their economies, and in particular how we can associate it with the rise of the Netherlands economy to be the richest economy in the world. Thirdly, I'll address the issue of how England came to be the richest country in the world, how the Industrial Revolution happened in England, by talking about some of what was happening before the Industrial Revolution. First of all, I'll talk about a period known as the Enlightenment and what you might call new science. And then I'll talk more specifically about what was happening in England before the Industrial Revolution, how England came to be a high-wage economy even before the Industrial Revolution, and what was happening in agriculture and industry in England at that time. In the next part of the lecture, I'll be taking up the first of these questions, how we can explain the Malthusian era.